Well, good morning. It's Monday, July 10th, and today we're going to talk about a blockbuster federal court case in which a U.S. District Court judge has issued an injunction which blocks internet censorship. And specifically, we're going to be talking about the blocking of the federal government from censoring outfits like Twitter and Facebook and that type of thing. So in any event, what I want to do first is I'd like to do just a brief update on the Ukraine war. We've talked about this considerably. Several weeks ago, we were reporting that the vaunted Ukrainian counteroffensive had failed, at least for the time being. It's interesting that the mainstream media, which was constantly touting the capture of several trivial little settlements, has now begun to acknowledge that it's more than begun, but they've almost uniformly agreed now that the counteroffensive has not gone as planned. On Sunday, the Wall Street Journal reported that Kiev's effort to push south through Russian territory toward the Sea of Azov has stalled. This is the exact language that we used several weeks ago. Now, the Ukrainians did manage to capture, I think, a total of 8 of these tiny villages. They're almost better termed settlements than villages. One of them, actually, the name translates to the words 5 villages. Or rather 5 houses. So now, who knows? It may have grown a bit, but I think the total population of the village was 300. And there are lots of places in the United States that don't even have names if they have a settlement of 300 people. So these are very small places and not of any real significance. And in turn, the Ukrainian army has lost a tremendous number of armored vehicles, tremendous amount of unnecessary bloodshed. So it has been a bloodbath. It's been a failure. And now, to top this off, the Biden administration has become increasingly desperate, and they keep upping the ante on these wonder weapons that are going to win the war. And the most recent thing is they said, okay, we have long said that the use of cluster bombs is a war crime. I think it was Jen Psaki, or anyway, the spokesman, who said that the use of cluster bombs is, of course, a war crime. And I think they were suggesting, there had been suggestions that the Russians may have used them. I'm not sure that was ever settled one way or the other, but I don't think it's out of the question. But in any event, I don't think the Russians have used them widely. They may have used them somewhere, but I just don't know. But in any event, the Biden administration, which had considered the use of cluster bombs a war crime, now says it's okay because Ukraine needs them. And it's also interesting that Ukraine is saying, well, we're willing to accept the fact that lots and lots of little children are maimed and killed by these cluster bombs. What they do, they explode into a multitude of landmines that are very residual, and they just go all over the place. They're not mapped out where they can later be removed. And so what happens is that maybe for 10 years, children playing out in the woods just stumble on one of these and it blows their leg off. This has happened. And this is why so many nations of the world have outlawed the cluster bombs. But in any event, it's just interesting watching the hypocrisy of the administration, where first they accuse the Russians of using these, and they say this is a war crime and we're going to take action on it. Now they say, well, it's okay because Ukraine needs them. So, and under that same logic, you know, the United States has said that poison gas is a forbidden, you know, weapon. This was one of the pretexts that we used. We pretended that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. I think they were talking about gas, poison gas. Well, through NATO, we managed to supply Iraq with poison gas during its war with Iran. This is when Iran had the uprising with the Ayatollah, and it was a somewhat of a regional threat. It was a significant regional threat. This is back in '79, where the Ayatollah's people seized the American embassy and took the embassy officials hostage for the better part of a year, I think. But in any event, so we felt very threatened by this, and so we were determined that we were going to help Iraq to fight this war with Iran. And eventually, Iraq was just running out of manpower. So the United States, it was always very vague, but we know it came out of Europe through some convoluted channels. Almost certainly it was green lighted by the United States that poison gas, old World War I weapons like mustard gas, that type of thing, were used on the Iranians, who then were driving through some of the marshlands of Iraq, and the poison gas stopped the Iranian forces from advancing and eventually ended the war. So we're willing to hang people by the neck if they use it, unless we're the ones using it. And it's the same thing. I'm not sure. We're giving them cluster bombs now. Maybe there will become a time when it's so desperate over there for Ukraine that we say, look, we're going to give you mustard gas. We're going to give you these other weapons that you can use. We'll see. I hope it doesn't come to that, but right now we're in a situation where the administration, Biden administration, has said that Ukrainians are going to have to continue fighting this war for as long as it takes, and so we will see how long that lasts, because they can't just carry on forever. Okay, with that, I want to switch to really one of the most monumental cases that has come along in a long, long time. And this is a case that's just come out of a federal district court. And there was a very sweeping ruling by Judge Terry A. Dowdy. And he was a judge, a federal district judge, who was appointed, who was nominated by President Trump. And he has ruled on a case that was brought by Republican attorneys general from, I believe, Missouri and Louisiana. And those attorneys general accused the Biden administration of enabling a sprawling federal censorship enterprise, and that they have coordinated and pressured the internet media to censor conservative viewpoints. And you can think of the things in particular: the vaccine. Any criticism of the vaccine, if you whispered some criticism, if you said, "Hey, look, children don't need this because the COVID virus doesn't hurt children," you were immediately censored. Didn't matter that it was true. It was that it interfered with this monumental movement, this enormous profits being made by the drug industry. If you were to say, "I don't think it helps to wear these masks because the CDC has said that they're ineffective," you were immediately censored, pulled off the internet. Some people had a lot of money invested in these shows, and they were just wiped out because not because they told something that was false, but because they said something that was true that was very politically awkward. The same thing has happened with the elections. We had what appeared to the normal eyes and ears to be massive voter fraud. Now, all of the mainstream media has band together and said, so-and-so falsely accuses, or without foundation accuses. Well, I don't know. I mean, we had, what do we have? Was it 1,000 or 10,000? I don't know. At least 1,000 sworn affidavits by people who had witnessed voter fraud. We had video evidence of people committing voter fraud. We had, in all of one of them, I believe, Donald Trump was winning by a substantial margin until they shut down the voting overnight. They excluded all the Republicans from being in the voting places. They allowed only Democrats to be in. And in you woke up in the morning and all of a sudden the Democrats were winning everywhere. So it was not unreasonable that that a large portion of the American public concluded that this was a very, very fraudulent election, one that was rigged, one that was fixed. But the government felt, particularly the Biden administration, felt it was very urgent that no one should be allowed to question what had happened. And of course, a lot of people say, "Oh, well, look, the courts didn't throw out the election." Well, courts are not in the business of throwing out elections. Unless it is a very narrow, specific issue, courts aren't just going to wade in and say, "Well, it doesn't look like this was a fair election, and there's all this stuff, 1,000 different issues in all these different places." They're not about to jump into something as controversial as that. And so in any event, this internet censorship has become a very, very powerful tool for Democrat politicians, for liberals. They've set up the Stanford Internet Observatory. But it's not just observing. Apparently, it is actively, at least advising on what are, who's saying what? We've got the University of Washington Center for an Informed Public. Now, that's an interesting name because apparently there's a lot of question about whether the Center for an Informed Public isn't really some kind of a center for a properly informed public, one that receives the information that they're intended to receive. We've got this situations where the academics, federal government, and the internet social media platforms are colluding all together to suppress conservative speech. We've now heard this this notion that there's a lot of disinformation going on out there. Now you need to understand what is disinformation? Well, disinformation is information that is politically awkward for the Democrats. They would like to say, oh, no, it's stuff that's false. Well, if they were trying to keep off things that are false, then why not simply say, people who refer to men as women and women as men, that's false. We'll censor that, but that's not the case. Well, as we talk, we're joined by my dear friend, Delegate Bob Marshall, former delegate. Bob, welcome to the show.
Dick, thank you. Through some mistake of my own, I managed to log into your program.
Okay. All right. Well, let me give a little introduction for our audience. Our guest today is Delegate Bob Marshall. Bob Marshall worked as a congressional staffer for very prominent members of the House and the Senate. Bob was the man who devised the famous Hyde pro-life amendment. That was his brainchild, and he convinced Democrat Henry Hyde to sponsor the Hyde Amendment, which has continued to be a mainstay of the federal government's restriction on federal spending for abortion over decades and decades. Very, very important thing. Bob Marshall was the one who conceived it, and interestingly, it was the one bill that made Henry Hyde famous. I think that's what he's known for today, is the Hyde Amendment. In any event, Bob was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates, where he served for 26 years. Marshall was among the most prolific and successful legislators in the Commonwealth. He enacted much landmark legislation, including the Marriage Amendment and the ban on partial birth abortion, which I co-patroned with him. And in turn, he was the co-patron of my own parental consent bill. Bob Marshall was among the most prominent and influential Republican legislators in Virginia history. And to this day, he remains one of the most highly respected political figures in Virginia. So with that, welcome, Bob. I've told all the lies that I can, and now it's up to you.
I know a priest you can go to confession to, so.
Well, and I'll just add, Bob and I were seatmates in the Virginia House of Delegates, where I spent 8 years before I lost an election that eventually propelled me to the Senate. And we were always pulling tricks like that on people, Bob. So,
right.
But in any event, we've begun our discussion about the federal district district judge who issued an injunction blocking the Department of Justice, the State Department, Health and Human Services, and the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, blocked them all from coordinating to suppress various conservative viewpoints and coordinating with the social media platforms to do that. What are your thoughts on this decision, Bob?
Well, I guess as expected, unfortunately, the Biden people are going to attempt to continue to suppress any opposition ideas or notions under the guise of preventing misinformation or disinformation. But in fact, the efforts that they succeeded in doing for some time were in fact suppressing true information. There were three organizations who filed amicus briefs, the Alliance Defending Freedom, the Children's Health Defense, which was Robert Kennedy's group dealing with vaccines, and then a group in Missouri, I think it's called the Ozark Foundation or something like that. They were representing private individuals working for corporations that were being pressured to mandatorily vaccinate everybody with basically an unproven vaccine. And in fact, if you read the Children's Health Defense brief, they just 1, 2, 3 document the statements that were false then about the claims of what the vaccine would allegedly do, and are false now. It's just that there's more evidence to demonstrate their falsity. But the effort to corral the American public to allow no dissent is really characteristic of totalitarian governments, or at least governments who really are not confident about their own policy. Because if you can't defend your policies in fair debate, there's something wrong, probably with them. This was not a wartime, statement where you would find statements praising Stalin, although there were statements after the Nazis invaded Russia that did come out that way, but it was remarkably successful, and the suit was brought by the attorney generals of Missouri and Louisiana. The decision of the district court is really far-reaching and detailed. And I always do this. I always read people who I don't agree with. And I picked that up when I went to a Catholic college, Belmont Abbey in North Carolina, where they had us read St. Thomas Aquinas, who regularly did these things. He even said, it seems it's possible God does not exist. And he put forth the reasons to do that. And then he said, on the contrary, I assert the following. But that really is how debate in a democracy should proceed. It should not be a sledgehammer approach that if you disagree with me, you either are guilty of treason, hatred, bitterness, you're stupid, or you're myopic. That is, all those are ad hominem attacks on people, and it does not deal with the issue at hand. But that's what we're dealing with right now. And apparently this one with the Biden administration with these cluster bombs. You had Jen Psaki, who was his former press secretary, made a comment. It's public. You can find it if you want. That the use of cluster bombs, which they were alleging about the Putin efforts in Ukraine, was a criminal act. Well, wait a minute. Now, Biden wants to do this because through his efforts, we're totally out of 155 millimeter howitzer shells, and we're using these cluster bombs. So so much for wearing down the Russians. We're wearing out our supply. But if Biden does it, it's immaculate. If Putin is alleged to have done it, It's vile. So this is what's called identity politics.
Bob, I think it's called the immaculate exception.
Or the immaculate deception, one of the two. I don't know, but that's what we're dealing with: a government that looks at persons and makes decisions based on whatever their attitudes are, rather than principles and facts. And that's very dangerous because you easily start identifying anybody you differ with as basically not worthy to be protected by the civil law and orders or have any respect at all. So that is a structure that is now being really part and parcel of everything this Democrat administration does, and it's not helpful to anybody.
No, it's a very dangerous thing. There's a show called InfoWars, and some years ago, it was a very powerful platform. It contacted about 3 million people in its heyday. And they were always on the edge. Alex Jones had sort of an edgy demeanor, and occasionally they would go over the line a little bit, and they'd say something that some of us thought was incorrect, and in fact they ended up in a big lawsuit over some of it. But in any event, I thought it was fascinating when this was the first attempt to shut down conservative media. And it appeared to me to be very well coordinated, because first you had one platform announce that they were pulling them off. Then you had another one, then another one, then another one. Then PayPal defunded them, and it just went, in a very smooth fashion, to where basically they just turned off the cash flow of the entire organization. And I think they chose InfoWars just because it was very edgy. But the fact is, I mean, if you go back to Revolutionary War days, I'm sure that many of the people who were influential in that were considered very edgy folks. And some people would say you and I are a little bit edgy, but right. but if you I always agreed with the Supreme Court when it made the very controversial ruling that the burning of the American flag was protected speech. And that is very controversial, I'm sure, even to this day. But to me, the ability to express yourself in that way, even though I hate to see it, and most people do, I love the flag, but to me, free speech is it's sort of the foundation on which our entire republic operates. If you don't have free speech, you simply cannot have a successful republic. It just simply can't work. And so much as I disliked it, I respected the Supreme Court's decision there. Now, it's interesting that we are beginning to see instances where people will tear down the rainbow sodomy flag or burn the rainbow sodomy flag, and they're being charged with hate crimes for doing it. Well, it's kind of amazing that it's free speech to burn the American flag, but if you burn the LGBT pride in grooming flag, then that becomes a criminal act. And of course, you cannot make that distinction rationally, but it's sort of a question of whose ox is gored. The Democrats, the liberals, we're very comfortable with the decision on the burning of the American flag. On the other hand, you must not desecrate the flag that stands for pedophilia, for child grooming, and all of this business. So it's really a matter of whose ox is gored, isn't it?
Well, this is very interesting, what you've mentioned here. The First Amendment was drafted in order to protect political speech. It wasn't drafted to protect fighting words or anything like this. And that has been the case from the beginning of the Republic up until now, for the most part. And it doesn't normally apply to private individuals. But what they're going on here is, I mean, and Biden the people around him are very shrewd. I can't say too much for the president's operative cognitive powers, but anyway, he's got smart people around him. And what they're doing, they're having third parties, private parties, carry out what they could not do directly. And they are the ones then censoring speech or threatening alteration of legal status of these big internet companies, that if you don't cooperate, we're going to make you liable for, not just for, in other words, there's an exemption for being a common carrier. If a UPS guy or gal brings something to your house and there's, bad chemicals in it, UPS is not guilty of it. The same with ideas. So they're taking the shield, I think it's section 230 of one of the federal laws, and saying we may rescind that if you think you know better than we do about what should be suppressed or criticized. But I never liked it when somebody would tell me, now the following is false. So you know what? I think I've got a sufficient intellect. I can figure it out myself or find out if what's going on is false or not. This is unbelievably condescending and patronizing. That's what's going on here. But we have got to stand up and defend this. I mean, and you're right about the various flags. I suspect if some of these statutes were litigated, the hate speech aspect of it would fall down, even if it may provoke some squeamishness or discomfort among certain elements of the population. It just has to be there to allow this to happen. I remember, who was it? Clarence Darrow, one of the famous litigants, defenders, talking about free speech of all kinds, and he defended it was the Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee, and he said you should be allowed to to teach this, even if it's false or if there's problems with it. But we've lost that now, and it's all speech is apparently not favored at this point. And if you're in charge, if you're in the Democrat side here, unfortunately, that's what you're getting. I hope the Republicans don't get infected with this if they regain some political offices. But this is not beneficial to anybody.
Well, I certainly agree with that. Bob, it's been great having you with us. We'll have to have you back. We appreciate you being with us. And so thank you to our listeners, and we will be back with you next Monday and see what the news holds for us then.
Thank you, Dick.
Bye.